Camping had always been my escape, a way to disconnect from the chaos of daily life and reconnect with nature. This trip was no different. I packed my gear, kissed my wife goodbye, and drove to the secluded campsite deep in the heart of Blackwood Forest. The weather was perfect. Crisp autumn air and a clear sky promised a peaceful weekend. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the trees. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a fire going. The crackling flames and the rustling of leaves created a symphony of nature that lulled me into a sense of calm. After cooking dinner and enjoying a couple of beers, I leaned back in my camping chair, gazing up at the star-filled sky. The forest was alive with sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I felt a deep sense of contentment, a rare peace that only nature could provide. But as the night grew darker, a strange feeling washed over me. It started as a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if I were being watched. I shook it off, attributing it to my overactive imagination. Still, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder into the shadowy woods. The firelight created dancing shadows, and every now and then I thought I saw movement just beyond its reach. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a deer or some other nocturnal animal. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Deciding to turn in early, I doused the fire, double-checked the tent zippers, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The forest sounds continued, but now there was an underlying tension, a quiet that seemed too complete. My eyes grew heavy, and despite my unease, I drifted off to sleep. A sudden snap of a twig jolted me awake. My heart pounded as I lay there, straining to hear anything beyond the rhythmic pounding in my chest. The tent was pitch black, and the only sound was the wind rustling the leaves outside. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling with the switch. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar interior of my tent. Just as I began to relax, I heard it. A low, guttural growl. My blood ran cold. It wasn't the growl of any animal I knew. It was deep, almost like a rumble, vibrating through the ground. I shone the flashlight towards the sound, but the beam barely penetrated the thick fabric of the tent. Gathering my courage, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The night was eerily quiet, the usual forest sounds absent. I swung the flashlight around, its beam cutting through the darkness. My breath fogged in the cold night air as I scanned the area. Then, just at the edge of the light, I saw it. Two glowing eyes staring back at me. They were unnaturally bright, reflecting the light like a cat's, but larger and more menacing. The growl came again, louder this time, sending a shiver down my spine. I backed away, heart racing as the creature stepped forward into the light. It was tall, hunched over, with matted fur and long, sinewy limbs. Its face was a grotesque mix of animal and human, with a wide mouth filled with sharp teeth. It looked at me with a predatory hunger, as if deciding the best way to attack. Instinct took over. I grabbed a burning log from the fire pit and brandished it like a weapon, the flames casting flickering shadows over the creature. It hissed, recoiling from the light and heat. I took the opportunity to retreat, keeping the fire between us. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice trembling. The creature growled again, a sound that echoed through the trees. It took a step forward but hesitated, eyes locked on the burning log. I knew the fire was my only protection, and I needed to keep it between us until I could figure out a way to escape. Slowly, I moved towards my car, the creature mirroring my movements, always keeping a safe distance from the fire. My heart pounded in my chest, the fear almost overwhelming. I reached the car, fumbled with the keys, and unlocked the door. I slid inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. The creature approached, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It scratched at the windows, growling and hissing, but the glass held. I started the engine, the roar of the car momentarily startling the creature. I floored the gas pedal, speeding away from the campsite and leaving the creature behind. As I drove through the dark forest, the sense of dread slowly lifted. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I pulled into a brightly lit gas station and parked. I sat there, trembling, as the reality of what had happened sank in. The creature in the woods was real, and it was still out there. I knew I would never return to Blackwood Forest, and I would never forget those glowing eyes staring at me through the darkness. The memory of that night would haunt me. Camping by Moonlit Lake had been a dream of mine for years. It was a secluded spot, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest and crowned by a crystal-clear lake that mirrored the night sky perfectly. After a grueling week at work, I decided it was finally time to get away and find some peace. I arrived at the lake in the late afternoon, the sun casting a golden hue over the water. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and prepared my fishing gear for the next day. The tranquility of the place was intoxicating, a balm for my stressed mind. As dusk settled, I lit a campfire, its flickering flames dancing against the growing darkness. After a simple dinner, I sat by the fire, listening to the soothing sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, and the occasional hoot of an owl. The night was calm, the moon casting a silvery glow over the lake, making it look almost ethereal. As the hours passed, I felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I shrugged it off as nerves or perhaps the effects of being alone in such a remote place. The fire had died down to embers, and I decided it was time to turn in. I doused the fire, zipped up my tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. I must have drifted off quickly because the next thing I knew, I was startled awake by a sound outside. I lay still, listening intently. There it was again, a soft splash, like something moving in the water. My heart rate quickened. I told myself it was probably a fish or a beaver. Still, the sound persisted, and I felt compelled to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as possible. The night air was cool against my skin as I stepped out, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I walked cautiously towards the lake, the splash growing louder with each step. As I reached the shoreline, the beam of light fell on the water, revealing nothing, just the calm, reflective surface of the lake. I let out a shaky breath, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. I turned to head back to the tent when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the moonlight. My heart leapt into my throat. The figure was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. It didn't move, just stood there watching me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. There was no response. The figure remained still, its presence unnerving. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure stepped forward and I could see its eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness like twin embers. A chill ran down my spine. I turned and ran back to my tent, zipping it up behind me. I fumbled with my backpack, pulling out my hunting knife. My mind raced with questions. Who or what was that? What did it want? Minutes felt like hours as I sat in the tent, knife in hand, listening for any sound outside. Then I heard it. The soft crunch of footsteps on the forest floor growing closer. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps stopped just outside the tent. The fabric of the tent rustled as if something was brushing against it. Summoning every ounce of courage, I shouted, "Go away, I'm armed!" There was silence, followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the tent. My blood ran cold. This was no human. The tent walls bulged inward as if something was pressing against them, and I could see the outline of a hand, if it could be called that. I slashed at the tent with my knife, hoping to scare it off. The growl turned into a shriek, and the pressure against the tent ceased. I waited, my heart pounding, but the growling and rustling had stopped. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The campsite was empty, the moonlight casting eerie shadows on the ground. I decided then and there to leave. I packed up my gear as quickly and quietly as possible, constantly glancing over my shoulder, expecting the creature to return at any moment. I made my way to my car, throwing my gear into the back seat and started the engine. As I drove away, I looked back one last time. There, standing at the edge of the forest, illuminated by the taillights, was the figure. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent intensity, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from Moonlit Lake. The sense of dread lingered, and I knew I would never return to that place. The memory of those glowing eyes and the guttural growl would haunt me forever. What had lurked in the shadows of Moonlit Lake I would never know. But one thing was certain. Some places are meant to be left undisturbed. I'd worked at Blackwood Summer Camp for 3 years, and it had always been a place of laughter and adventure. But this summer felt different. The camp director, Mr. Thompson, had grown increasingly anxious as the weeks passed, his eyes darting to the tree line whenever he thought no one was looking. The older counselors whispered about strange noises and shadows, but I dismissed it as campfire stories meant to scare the new kids. It was the last night of camp and the children had gone to bed after the farewell bonfire. I was assigned to night watch, making sure everything was secure before we closed the camp for the season. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the silent cabins and the dark, encroaching forest. I made my rounds, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the dense darkness. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, seemed oddly muted tonight. I shrugged off the growing unease and checked the cabins one by one, making sure all the kids were asleep. The last cabin, Cabin 6, was at the edge of the woods, and as I approached it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The door creaked open and I peered inside. The kids were sound asleep, their soft snores filling the room. Satisfied, I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a shadow flitting between the trees. I froze, my heart pounding. The beam of my flashlight revealed nothing but the dense forest. I shook my head, trying to dispel the fear creeping into my mind, and closed the cabin door. As I walked back to the main lodge, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickened my pace. The silence was oppressive, each step echoing in the stillness. I reached the lodge, and as I opened the door, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The scream came from the direction of Cabin 6. I sprinted back, my heart racing. When I reached the cabin, the door was wide open. Inside, the kids were sitting up in their beds, eyes wide with fear. "Stay here," I ordered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll check it out." I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. The forest seemed to close in on me, the darkness thick and impenetrable. I heard rustling behind me and turned, the beam catching a glimpse of something pale and gaunt disappearing into the trees. I hesitated, then followed, my curiosity overriding my fear. The forest was a maze of shadows and twisted branches. I moved cautiously, the flashlight my only guide. Suddenly I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin that I'd never seen before. The windows were broken and the door hung ajar, creaking in the slight breeze. Compelled by a force I couldn't explain, I approached the cabin. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding. As I stepped inside, the flashlight flickered and died. Darkness enveloped me, and I fumbled to replace the batteries. When the light came back on, I gasped. The walls were covered in strange symbols drawn in what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room, a wooden table held a grotesque makeshift altar. My stomach churned as I recognized objects from the camp, broken toys, bits of clothing, and most horrifying of all, photographs of the campers. A sudden noise made me spin around. There in the doorway stood a figure. It was the shape of a man, but its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, and it had a twisted, malevolent grin. I backed away, my flashlight shaking. The creature stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. What are you?" I stammered. The creature's grin widened. "I am the guardian of Blackwood," it hissed, its voice a raspy whisper. "You have trespassed on sacred ground." I didn't mean to," I stuttered. I'm just a camp worker. I'll leave, I swear." The creature laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the cabin. "It's too late. You've seen too much." It lunged at me, and I turned and ran, bursting out of the cabin and into the forest. I ran blindly, branches scratching at my skin, the creature's laughter following me. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, gasping for breath. I made it back to the main lodge, slamming the door behind me. The other counselors gathered around, their faces pale with worry. I told them what I had seen, but their expressions told me they didn't believe a word. The next morning, as we packed up and the buses arrived to take the campers home, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I left Blackwood Summer Camp, vowing never to return. But the memory of that night and the creature's hollow eyes would haunt me forever.